Hello, everyone out there. It is a great joy to welcome you to this edition, our latest edition of the IU webinar on the future of higher education. And today we will be speaking about the future of higher education and financing and discuss just what a well-financed higher education system might look like. For this, we have three formidable distinguished speakers. It would be Roberta Malee Bassett, the Global Lead for Tertiary Education and Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank. Roberta, wonderful to have you. Peter Maassen, Professor at the Department of Education, University of Oslo, and also Extraordinary Professor at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, as well as a Fellow at the Steinhardt Institute for Higher Education Policy at NYU in the US. And then finally, Paul Zeleza, Associate Provost and North Star Distinguished Professor at Case Western Reserve University, and also Honorary Professor at the Universities of Cape Town and Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. It is a great pleasure. We are speaking about financing in higher education, and of course that is a theme that is under our fingers and quite pertinent to anyone involved in the sector. So please allow me to make some first remarks and then we'll get started with the discussion. So what is the future of higher education institutions and what will they look like in terms of structure and perhaps in terms of their mission? In her welcoming address at the IU's 16th General Conference last year in Dublin, at the University College Dublin, the Assistant Director General, of course, for Education at UNESCO, Stefania Giannini, underlined some of the results that came out of last year's World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona that I'm sure many of you attended or followed. Higher education is part of the right to education and a public good, number one. A strategic force towards more sustainable, fair, and inclusive societies, number two. But then she also challenged the sector that universities must more forcefully engage as institutions of learning, research, and service to society. To do so, they must, one, democratize access to higher education, foster a new ecology of learning, one that nurtures critical mindsets and navigates the complexities of the world. And third, strengthen democratic societies, foster citizenship, equality, and through transformative education, contribute to just and sustainable societies. For this, we need to rethink higher education's disciplinary structure, forms of delivery, and governance. The World Higher Education Conference came up with some key catchphrases, and I'll just be very, very quick here. Equitable, sustainable access, a holistic student learning experience, to shift from a disciplinary silo or disciplinary silos to inter and transdisciplinarity, to come up with lifelong learning approaches that offer flexible learning pathways, to shift from an hierarchical and weakly connected institution or weakly connected institutions and programs to a more integrated approach, an integrated system with diversity of programs. So in short, the transformation of higher education, I guess in order to be more transformative in consequence, requires both the reimagination of higher education and, quite frankly, money. So to discuss both these pillars and how they interact, depend on each other, we are again delighted to have our three formidable speakers with us today. And I give the floor to Roberta to kick us off with a few remarks on the World Bank's latest framework, steering tertiary education towards resilient systems that deliver for all. Let's hope. Roberta, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And what a pleasure it is for me to be here with Peter and Paul and you on this panel today. And I look forward to the conversation. I really do. I'm excited to have a chance to talk about higher education and financing sort of outside of the rigidity of trying to assess models or trying to come up with formulas, which is often what these conversations turn into. And this one is going to be much more about how we use higher education, financing, and tertiary education in the parlance of the World Bank, since we talk more than just about universities, and we are talking about multiple forms of delivery. But how we can accommodate all of this expanded access, all of this diversification of systems with the funding that exists, and with maybe an idea to expanding funding sources or becoming just much more efficient and thoughtful about how and what we fund. So I'm very much looking forward to this new kind of a conversation around the topic, which I applaud IAU bringing to this forum, because it's very easy I think to keep distilling things down to the economics of higher education, and it's nice to actually have a chance to talk about the ethics and the sort of the contextualization of higher education financing outside of just money. So in that, I will say, this idea of what is a well-financed system that was in my article that I wrote for IAU's Horizon magazine emerged actually from a conversation I was having with African scholars, where I was talking about the STEER framework. And many of you may have sat through my presentation. I'm not presenting it today, much to the relief, I am sure, of those who have sat through it, although it is a really interesting, still to me, framework for thinking about policies and effective sort of agility in looking at the preparedness of higher education systems for all of these dynamic changes that are hitting the sector in different ways, but in certainly some shared areas. And so the STEER framework focuses on 5 organizational pillars that one can use, all of them, some of them, in assessing the sector in your own space for readiness and agility. And those are strategically diversified systems. Do you have the institutional types that are needed by your stakeholder community to address all of the strategic needs that tertiary education can address? Is it agile? Is it articulated so you can move from one institution source to a type to another type? Does it allow for lifelong access to higher skills development and other sort of exposures to further learning through the course of a life? The second one is technology. The T is obviously technology. We don't need to talk about technology except to say that everyone's using it, maybe to the detriment in some ways of what they're prepared to accommodate through technology, in some ways because it's transformatively useful. And that's a complex conversation for another webinar. The third one is equity. Equity is a conversation concern for all of us here in the session today, for everyone working in higher education. Expanded access isn't necessarily equitable. Expanded financing is not necessarily equitable. And so considerations of equity in all of these transformative strategic interventions is a clear importance for all of us. The fourth pillar is efficiency, and efficiency is sort of where this conversation around financing usually lands. Do you have the funds you need? Are they being spent properly? That is obviously an important consideration. It is couched in other forms of efficiency. Are your managers trained well? Are your regimes and your legislative environments defined in a thoughtful way that allows for agility and adaptation in the delivery of tertiary education? That's another kind of efficiency that we look at and consider. And then the last one is resilience. And I think this conversation about what is a well-funded higher education system does actually tie well to this concept of resilience. In this time of transformative change with every impact, today we're talking about artificial intelligence, right? And all the impacts of new technologies on learning and on assessment, on strategic utilization of new tools, but also on the change of the workforce. This is a resilience question for tertiary education. Can the education system manage in that space? All of these things come back to money. And so then I'll move to the point of this conversation today, which is about the financing tensions in which all of these policy pillars exist. And this idea of financing for strategic aims outside of labor market outcomes, and financing in a way that stops the traditional model of financing inputs, faculty salaries, the operational costs of institution, to financing strategic outcomes. And that's something that I think we will all talk about today, but is a key consideration for World Bank support for financing reforms in the countries where we work. This idea of steering requires, this concept of maximizing the value of these investments. And by investments, I'm not just talking about public investments, but also personal investments. We often talk about private, but private kind of mixes between private institutions, private providers, the private sector. In this case, I think we really are talking about personal investments, right? The opportunity cost of attending higher education, but also the spend. How much can and would somebody be willing to spend on their higher education experience? This is something we're going to talk about more today. And I think it's something we cannot ignore in the equation of what financing looks like for the sectors anymore. So I hope this conversation is going to be very non-prescriptive. We know it will not be an application of sort of uniform thinking around how we should finance higher education. What does it look like for any one place? It's going to be different from someplace else. It does nonetheless require purposefulness, which is why we again refer back to steering, right? Steering is a purposeful activity that utilizes lots of inputs, but directs activities and strategies and financing in a way that can lead to a goal that hopefully is one that has been defined in a shared manner for an outcome that all stakeholders agree is important. So with this, I will turn it back over to you and to my fellow panelists for what I hope is going to be an engaged and long conversation, especially with questions and answers coming from the audience as well.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Roberta, for firing off. Indeed. Steering, here it is, steering tertiary education. And what I really like about it is that we get a definition of what steering means on page 4, and it is the verb to direct the course, to pursue a course of action. And there's my first question to all of us really is steering means that there's an actor, an agent, so to speak. There is the verb to do so, and there's an object. So quite frankly, the basics of grammar. And I question who is the noun? Who is the subject in this equation, so to speak, in this grammar, in this sentence? Is it the governments? Is it the higher education institutions? Who are the stakeholders? But that's just one of the things that I'm questioning. Let me move over to Peter and ask Peter for some first remarks on the concept of steering.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and it's a great pleasure, as Roberta already was indicating, to have a chance to contribute to this panel and to discuss and address these key questions around financing, around funding of higher education. But as Roberta has so eloquently explored already, they go much further than the funding per se, the models, the formulas. So let me start in reflecting on this concept of steering on what, in my view, is a basic question that is addressed in the transformation of higher education currently. And that is the question, what kind of university do we want for what kind of society? Because the question of steering is, of course, related to objectives. You want to know in which direction you want to steer higher education. And in order to get an agreement and an understanding of the nature of the transformation and the direction in which we want higher education to develop, we have to agree upon the main objectives. And Roberta introduced already a number of the key objectives around sustainability, equity, and equality, around objectives that to a large extent are global, but of course in every society there are specific objectives which need to be addressed. And in my view, the notion of steering isn't so much about who holds the wheel, but how can we agree upon the direction in which we want to move higher education. And from that perspective, in the further elaboration and conceptualization, operationalization of this notion of steering, it is important also to identify what is the role of the university and the university community in it, because it's not like a flag in the wind waiting for the environment, for society to tell the higher education community in which direction it wants to move. It has a clear and very important role in societal development because of its key mandate in developing and transferring and creating knowledge. So as a knowledge institution, what is the direction? What does steering mean? And how can we create circumstances in which we can get a better understanding of, and also a clear agreement of the direction in which higher education should develop? And that in a context where participation all around the world has increased. Africa is still at a relatively low level, but if you look at the growth patterns in Africa, also their participation is increasing, and the demographic developments, as discussed, for example, in Europe, indicate that by 2035, 2040, at least 40% of all students in the world would come from Africa. So what does that mean as part of the question on transformation? And the final issue to address is the way in which universities communicate, because I think that is a feature that hasn't received the kind of attention that it should in the public and academic debates about higher education, but that's crucial. How can we stimulate university leaders to become more effective in communicating and in contributing to the discussion, the overall discussion about what kind of university, what kind of society, but also contributing to a further understanding of an agreement on the objectives, the aims with respect to higher education. And with that, I give back to you, Andreas, and also look forward to the further conversations around this key topic that we will have this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So yes, we'll come back to your three major points in a moment. First, let us go to Paul and for first reactions on the concept of steering that Roberta so kindly shared with us, and then we'll dig right in. Peter, you're absolutely right. Communication, what kind of direction for higher education more generally. These are the discussions we will be speaking about indeed. But first to Paul, thank you.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is a wonderful forum for us to share ideas about the current state and the future of higher education. I think this framework helps us to identify some of the key challenges as well as opportunities that we need to think about. In thinking about higher education generally and where we're going, Andreas, the two issues perhaps we might want to focus on. What are the challenges that we're trying to address? And who are the actors who need to be involved in addressing those challenges? And generally, in terms of the challenges, issues of institutional supply and access are critical. That, of course, also has elements of affordability, of accountability, and so on and so forth. And then secondly, the question of institutional inputs. Point was made that we have been focusing too much perhaps on inputs, and that we need also to focus a lot on the outcomes. The inputs, of course, still remain relevant in terms of, for example, the faculty pipeline, which is a challenge in many African countries, where institutions are growing much more rapidly than the availability of human capital in terms of faculty and high-level staff and so on and so forth. And then there are, of course, other inputs that one can talk about. But thirdly is the quality of institutional outputs. And here, I think the STA framework helps us to think through. And one is talking about the quality of graduates, the quality of research, the impact of that research, and so on and so forth. And then fourth is the question of institutional connectivity or connections with society, with the labor market, with civil society, with producing civic awareness, and so on and so forth. That is politically critical in sustaining democratic societies. And of course, we are all emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the implications? What lessons have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? And what are institutions trying to do in addressing those lessons? Some, of course, are in a hurry to return to the past, a restoration agenda, pre-COVID ways of doing things, which of course, in my view, after a major crisis, that's probably a waste of time. Others are trying to, graft some of the lessons into reforming how they do business. So a reform agenda. And others, saying the crisis was so deep and the impact so, broad that we need to think about a reform agenda. A transformation agenda, really transforming how investors, do their business. So the challenges, I think, identifying them is quite critical, but also identifying the actors. And certainly the actors include the state. The state will always be a major actor, whether we're talking about financing, establishing the regulatory environment for the operation of the higher education institutions. And then, of course, the students are critical actors, because after all, the education is for them. And increasingly, they're the ones bearing the costs of education in terms of rises in tuition and fees and so on and so forth. And another, key player has to be the private sector. And here there are challenges, as we will discuss later, the ways in which the private sector, certainly in Africa, plays a role in higher education. Apart from simply, acquiring the human capital that has been produced from the universities, to what extent are they participating in creating institutional, capacities that will produce the kinds of graduates that they want? In addition to that, of course, in the context of Africa, is the role of international, partners, international, players. And here one is talking about, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, and a whole range of other international players. What is the role that they are playing in this landscape? And of course, society itself, broadly, in terms of civil society and so on and so forth, has demands that it puts on higher education institutions. And finally, perhaps one can talk about the role of the philanthropic sector in Africa, which again is important both in terms of thinking about the diversification of revenue streams and the challenges there too. And another critical player is, of course, the African diaspora. To what extent is the African diaspora playing a role in the transformation of African investors?
Paul, Peter, Roberta, you've put a lot on the plate. Let's try and work through this one by one. Thank you very, very much for these first reactions indeed, and setting the scene. What, of course, comes to mind is, when it comes to money, is the strategy investment. So basically, how convincing is the higher education sector globally at the moment in making their case, in stating the relevance and value of higher education to society? And I think we all agree that there's much to be done, and it would be lovely to have your first reactions. Maybe Roberta, you will start us off. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. And I think this plays on a point that Peter made very clearly in his statement as well, which is something we all agree on. I think the universities must do a better job, just in every possible way, in communicating their value to society, and including the beyond knowledge value to society as well. It is now a highly politicized space in much of the world, this higher education narrative. What is the value? Is it worthwhile? Are there alternatives for students to skip university, to skip higher education? What is the value proposition? University leaders have to be able to offer that value proposition in a 2-minute soundbite and a 30-second soundbite. I mean, because they know it. They know what their proposition is. And if they don't know it, now is the time to sit down and really think about that. And we talk a lot about, in our space, we recognize this fear of vocationalization of the knowledge agenda, right? I understand completely this fear, or this, it's not even a fear, it's this deep reluctance to look at higher education as a vocational experience, as a vocational provider. And that's a completely historically reasonable take, except today students want to know what they're getting from their education, right? It isn't just enough they're going to become better people, more interesting people, which we know they are. They want to know there's going to be a job on the other side and that it's going to be a worthwhile time that they have spent. University leaders and faculty can actually explain the skills that they develop through their curriculum that almost reverse engineers this skills question. What can they do when they finish university? So many things. They can write well, they can think well, they can ask important questions, they can debate and work in teams well. All of these things with employers clearly say they want, universities can provide, but they do an awful job at explaining that. And this is the time of year as the exams come through, graduations come out, students start deciding where they're going to go to school. There'll be articles in newspapers all over the world explaining why higher education is overrated. And each university president, each university vice chancellor should have a very quick response to that says, actually, here's what we do. These are the ways in which we make our students' lives better and our communities stronger and our democracy stronger. I mean, everything we know that they can do, but they just don't do a very good job being on the front foot of this conversation. It's responsive and reactive, a little defensive. And it would be nice, I think, and really important actually, as the policy debates rage around investments and further investments, expanded investments, private, personal investments. Is it worth it? They need to be able to say how it is, because we know it is and the research supports it, but they should be able to articulate it better, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Peter, right over to you.
Yes, I fully agree. And I would argue that it's extremely important that university leaders learn to become more proactive and not wait for questions about public and private investments in their institutions. We all know, and as Roberta was indicating, research shows it, what the public and private investments in higher education, what they bring in return, what the advantages and the benefits of higher education are for society as the key knowledge institution in any society. That doesn't mean that there isn't a need for the transformation that we addressed at the beginning, absolutely. But in order to also make sure that the support for higher education, the financial and the broader political, socioeconomic support remains and continues to make the benefits of higher education for society possible. We have to make sure that the universities realize that they're no longer an isolated institution relatively in the margins of society, but they're at the core. They're more important than ever before, but part of society is seeing them as elite, as being part of the problem, where previously they were part of the solution to any problem. Now they're part of the problem and contribute to inequality, as also scientific academic studies argue. So what is it that universities have to do? Again, what Roberta introduced is absolutely a key issue. Communicate proactively, have 30 seconds, 2 minutes, but also responses ready, but also think through the way in which communication has developed over the last 20 years. It has professionalized, but it's become more PR than communication. Rethink communication and make sure that the university does justice to the trust of still a large part of society in higher education by making a convincing case of the importance of higher education for society. So this is a key role for institutional leaders where really a lot of progress has to be made.
Peter, you just mentioned institutional leaders, and we indeed have an institutional leader right before us, Paul. So it is a bit mean of me to actually throw the questions that Peter and Roberta have just posed. So I'll just pass it right on. What is the relevance and value of higher education? And you, as a university leader, what is your 2-minute response that the two others were asking for?
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I agree with everything that has been said, that we have to be proactive and communicate very clearly. I usually tell people that university education provides what I call the 4 I's: intrinsic, intellectual, instrumental, and idealistic values. The intrinsic values of higher education lie in the sheer joy of learning for its own sake, asking the big questions, making discoveries, cultivating a lifelong quest for learning, and developing passionate individuals and passionate learners. The intellectual value is embodied in the very sort of capaciousness and versatility, the content richness and the treasures of knowledge in the various disciplines, interdisciplines that are available in universities. And then, of course, the instrumental value of education is the cultivation of invaluable skills and competencies for the world of work, including critical thinking, oral and communication skills, problem solving, creative sensibilities, and of course, very specific skills that can be provided. And then, of course, the idealistic value of higher education is the vital contribution to the development of character and citizenship. I think
mission accomplished, I would say, indeed. Thank you, Paul. No, absolutely excellent. But with these 4 eyes, I mean, Paul, just to get back to you again, having been up till very, very recently the president of a university in Kenya, indeed, those 4 eyes, I mean, how would you go about then communicating that also vis-a-vis the question that we're posing ourselves today, funding, money?
Yeah, so I think you need to make sure that you as the university leader communicate very clearly to the state, because the state remains a very powerful force. And a lot of government officials, when you talk to them, are not fully convinced, particularly certain disciplines in the humanities, social sciences. They think they're really a waste of time. While STEM seems to be given a bit more consideration. And you need to emphasize that all these fields of study are critical for different reasons, and that universities, we are trying to develop interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary ways of knowing, of understanding, of studying, of learning, and so on. Secondly, you have to be able to talk to and convince the corporate sector. So the corporate sector has to be involved, not simply in acquiring talent from higher education institutions, but also being part and parcel of producing that talent through, which means when we are developing curricula, we need to be able to talk to the corporate sector, find out exactly what are the skill sets they are looking for. It doesn't mean that you're completely, driven by that, but you have to understand that in order to develop the kind of curricula that is going to be relevant, while of course imparting the enduring values of higher education. It has to have relevance in terms of employability. And you can also, through that, of course, generate the kinds of resources that may be necessary to undertake those kinds of things. And then I think thirdly, you have to be able to also communicate with the public. A lot of university leaders are very shy of sort of speaking to the public, because one wrong statement and your goose is cooked. A generation ago, 2 generations ago, university leaders used to be public, they would carry the public conscience and speak about national issues, international issues. Now, of course, the cost of doing that is risen because of polarization and so on. But you have to be able to comment on key developments in the world, about politics, about the environment, about development, about where we are going, because silence will not remove those problems. It will, in fact, you are abdicating the role of universities as the engines of enlightenment, sorry to use that word, of enlightening society. So you have to be able to develop communication skills in terms of the media, media savviness, traditional media, as well as, of course, new social media. And certainly you have to be able to begin to talk with the rich people. Now, I know that in the African context, a lot of us as academics, came from radical traditions, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, and we are very suspicious of rich people. In some cases for right reasons, because we know the source of their wealth is not quite clean. But you have to learn to talk to the African bourgeoisie. What makes them tick? You have to understand them, and you also have to engage them for opportunities in terms of generating the kinds of resources that will be useful. In the United States, for example, you find that much of the sort of fundraising, 70% typically comes from your alumni, and among those alumni, typically are those very, very rich people who you've produced that are giving you a lot of money. So you have to cultivate the ability to engage and communicate with the high net worth individuals whose numbers are exploding across Africa. So in other words, you have to learn to be somebody who moves from talking from one constituency, both the internal constituencies as well as the external constituencies, and get your message that is calibrated for different constituencies as clear as possible, with the intention of always promoting the fundamental mission and values of higher education as an institution in society that is undergoing rapid change, complex changes, and that is increasingly polarized.
Peter, can I just ask you, following up on what Paul just has shared with us, one, of course, is the communication itself, the value proposition that needs to be defined by higher education leaders. But how do you come to that value proposition? I'm thinking about the inner workings of the universities themselves. What are the communication structures within higher education institutions in order to facilitate exactly these kinds of, I guess, messages that then will lead into the 2 minutes or the 4 minutes or the 17 minutes that we were speaking about in terms of a value proposition? That is one question. So the inner workings of communication within a higher education institution, and then of course the general discourse of the value proposition between the universities themselves. Second question is, Paul has just spoken about the private sector very eloquently in Africa in terms of untapped potential for higher education funding. Of course, we know that the biggest funders of higher education institutions is in the public sector, of course, but there we need to have a debate about the funding responsibility. So public funding responsibilities, maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more about that as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Two important, relevant, but also challenging questions. The first one, let's say when it comes to the internal communication, the channels, the way that communication is taking place, etc. If I would put it very mildly, I would say there's room for improvement. In the various evaluation, assessment, strategic development activities of universities or networks of universities that I've been involved in over the last years, one complaint of staff and student is always communication, internal communication in the institution, in communication about change, communication about strategic development. And of course, it's not an easy task, as any university leader will acknowledge. But there's definitely room for improvement. And one issue that I would like to include here is that we've paid a lot of attention in the pandemic and before to the use of digital technologies in education to some extent research. We hardly discussed the use of digital technologies in governance, in university governance internally. So how can we use in a much more effective way digital technologies to stimulate the kind of communication that we until now in our panel have especially addressed from an external perspective. So I think that is a key area in order also to make sure that this is not an activity, the internal communication, which has become kind of an activity as an aim in itself, but that it really leads to outcomes. There are areas also there. We've done research within our network in Europe and worldwide when it comes to academic freedom, basic values. there's hardly an understanding among most academics and students within higher education on the concept of academic freedom, the importance of it, the meaning of it, the relevance of it. So that all has to be addressed in the internal communication that you are referring to. But it's, of course, coming back to your original question, crucial if we want to develop a common understanding of the way in which the university is identifying its main objectives, its contributions to social development, to economic development, political development, etc. That relates also to the second question, because in my view, in addition to the engagement or to the communication that we addressed, engagement is a key concept. Universities shouldn't only communicate in words, they should also communicate in actions. And there, for many universities around the world, the notion of social engagement and even of knowledge transfer is still seen as an add-on, not as a core part of the way in which the university as an institution should operate in society. The recognition of engagement activities of students and staff, the strategic development of key partnerships with the private sector in society, Paul addressed it, but also with civil society, strategic partnerships around environmental issues, renewable energy, sustainability, inequality, healthcare. There's in any society, whether it's an advanced economy, a very rich country like Norway, or countries that still are in a low income group, there are key challenges in society where the university could play a much more active role. So we need to develop the communicative or stimulate the communicative skills of university leaders, involve the university, the higher education institution as a whole in it. As said, there's enormous room for improvement there, also through the use of digital technology, and create an action plan. Let the knowledge transfer and the knowledge activities of universities not only be internal, but also link the public funding that you get to public actions and public activities through engagement and knowledge transfer, not only for commercial purposes, but for social and civil society development purposes also.
Roberta, Peter has led the way. In what ways can we define public funding responsibility, and how must public funding entities move to invest in higher education?
I mean, this is the sort of the bread and butter of what the World Bank discusses with our partner countries when we go in to build projects that support tertiary education. It is entirely around public borrowing, right? This is countries taking out massive loans, incurring debt to support higher education, tertiary education investments. And how do the technical teams on the ground in those countries defend that debt burden that comes with higher education investments? I think both Peter and Paul have articulated really well that the sort of broad environmental values of higher education to society. On the ground, though, when you're sitting with the Minister of Finance, they want to know what's coming out of the institutions that shows a real return of this public funding, because they're on the hook for that debt, and they're on the hook to the newspapers that will report on it, that the stakeholders that will care. And so there's some key interventions that the institutions can be doing better individually and across the system. One is graduate tracer studies and really paying attention to what's happening to their graduates when they exit the institution. Graduate tracer studies, of course, require sustained activity on the part of the institution year on year. There's a lot of tracer study, one-off research that says our graduates all got jobs, but one could look at the COVID years as a time that really showed you really have to know year on year what's happening. Either there's a recession, there's a pandemic, something happens that forces a disruption. It doesn't mean that your institution is no good, right? So you don't want the outcomes of these types of evaluations to be sort of stuck around one single experience. So I think graduate tracer studies are really important. There's also institutions could really do a lot more institutional research. This is something that the US institutions do very well. They have entire offices, right, that are just constantly collecting data. Who's going, who's graduating, what research is being done, what are the faculty members doing, how many patents are being done, like all sorts of contextual data that is explicit to the exercise of running and leading an institution, right, of any form, whether that's a community college or a world-class research university, it doesn't matter. Know where the money is going, know how it's being spent, know what kind of indicators matter when you're telling the story about if your institution is running well, if it's fit for purpose, is it achieving its mission. All of that requires really good localized data collection. What has happened in much of the world is household surveys or external actors who are trying to apply research methods to really sort of loose data systems, right? They're trying to collect data that doesn't exist at the institutional level, so they fabricate, you know, realistically maybe, or with at least some integrity behind the attempt. But still, bad data is bad data, and bad data tells bad stories. And so, good data institutional important. All of this comes together to tell a story of the value of the institution and the system to society, and that's where policymakers get the notions that they need to then go to Parliament or to have the negotiation with the Minister of Finance and say, this is a worthwhile investment, we're underinvesting. You can see in comparative data, and something Peter does a lot, and maybe Paul you do as well, this comparative data, who's investing how much, what are the outcomes from some systems and outcomes from other systems, what can we learn from this comparative environment? This is why people are participating in this workshop today. Is the same kind of questions that policymakers want to be able to have access to answers when they sit down and say, okay, well, if China had this momentous transformational economic development at the same time that they were investing in university expansion, is there something for us to learn about that? That's really important, right? And the universities on the ground should be able to provide data that shows at least some commitment to understanding the outcomes of what they're doing. The last point, I had lots of points, but I think there's a big challenge at the institutional level to explain what things cost, what it costs to deliver. In much of the world, the budgets for higher education are determined by faculty salaries. The faculty salaries are not necessarily an operational cost per se, right? They are a cost, but is it necessary to spend that much money? What are the overhead costs? What is the real cost to delivery? Not the tuition that gets charged, or, you know, the ultimate price that's applied. What's the cost of delivery? Because in much of the world, higher education costs a lot more to deliver than they're getting in terms of funding, right? And so you see that in the US, especially, where the cost of all sorts of things have grown now in this time of inflation. The cost of delivering these programs are very high. Technology investments are incredibly expensive, but that is an argument for more funding, right? But they need to know what these things cost so that they can come back and say, we are providing this immense amount of service to society at bare bones financing because things cost more than you know. And most institutions have a hard time actually really going line item, saying this is what it actually costs to deliver what we do. And we do it really efficiently in most places. I'll stop there.
Just Roberta, just as a follow-up question, you sit down with the Minister of Finance in a country and they want to know what they get out of it, what the cost of it is, of course. Whatever happened to the intrinsic value of education, of a higher education value? Whatever happened to knowledge for knowledge's sake? Whatever happened to the formation of the individual? What's the price tag on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what universities should be able to provide. I don't know that I think a Minister of Education has any space to ask the question in that way, in terms of what they do and the service they provide for their societies. Ministers of Finance are on the hook for efficient spending of scarce state resources, right? And strategic spending based on political impacts. And so whoever's in charge of the government at the time, the political platform of the party in charge, wherever, this is true everywhere in the world. So for a Minister of Finance, it really is, can we defend the budget that we're bringing out to use public finances? It may be in a place like Norway, where a Minister of Finance would say, of course, this is an investment in social development as much as it is an economic development. And then you can dig down right into that conversation about the whole social envelope that is part of higher education's contribution. In many of our countries, though, where the resources are so scarce, What they really have to say is there is going to be a return on this investment. We can promise you this. And we, the economists at the World Bank, the higher education specialists at the bank, we try to craft models that can show return on that investment. We do know in the lowest income countries in the world, tertiary education has the highest private returns on investment. That's a very powerful argument with the Minister of Finance. And I have to say, in a very utilitarian way, I think that's enough. That's enough for me. If it means that I can get all the other externalities from higher education provided to society by saying it has an economic return, great. That's a very, it's very practical, and it may be a little reductive, but it actually can work. And so you have to know, I think Paul said this as well, you have to know who your audience is and what you need to get from them or what you're trying to convince them of, because this value proposition is on multiple levels. If it's a finance person and they just need to know the returns are worth the investment, then give them that argument, because the data, as we've been saying through this whole session, the research is there, the information is there. You can provide a pure economic returns argument and make the case strongly for Minister of Finance. You would make different arguments for the parents of potential students. Perhaps you'd make different arguments for an investor in a research center or something like that, right? But for a Minister of Finance, it has to be about efficient and effective spending of public resources.
Paul, Peter, any comments on that?
Yeah, I agree with her that you have to use different language, different arguments for different stakeholders that you're talking to, and one does not mean that you are not aware of the other arguments that can be made. I just wanted to sort of comment on what Peter said earlier also in terms of communication. And part of it is, there are formal practices that are dictated by the governance structures of the institution, processes of decision-making within the institution. And then there are the more informal ways of communicating, which involve, for example, the president and other leaders, deans, chairs, and so on, participating in academic co-curricular activities, and of course also participating in the media, as I noted earlier. But I think one point that Peter mentioned, which is extremely important, is the whole issue of knowledge transfer and knowledge translation. And for African universities, I think one of the key things is that the kind of research that is being done or should be done should be addressing the profound challenges or problems of that society, as well as, of course, of the region, of the continent, of the world, and so on. And a lot of the problems are really transnational problems. Environmental problems have particular articulations. If you are a landlocked country, or you are an arid country, or whatever, they have particular articulations. But you need to be able to address that. And unfortunately, in a lot of the research, the signals come from the global north, in which if you want to be quote unquote promoted, respected, and acquire that academic reputational capital, you have to make sure that your research is addressing problems identified elsewhere, because you are sending your articles there to be published. The levels of external epistemic relationship for Africa is extremely high. More African scholars publish with collaborators from other parts of the world than any other region in the world, which is almost a replica of the economic dependencies that we have, in which you have raw materials, send them abroad, they are sort of processed into manufactured goods, and you import them. That epistemic extraversion that as Huntonji, the Beninois philosopher, calls it, is something that we have to tackle in Africa, to make sure that the research is relevant. And to go to to the argument that Roberta was making, it also then helps you to talk to the Minister of Finance to say, we are solving these critical environmental issues, these critical gender issues, these critical human capital development issues, these critical technological issues as they affect our society. And they can see that you're doing that. And therefore, they may be more open to you to support what you're doing. And also the translation of research, I think, has to do with the relationship between academic institutions and think tanks. The range of think tanks across Africa is relatively small compared to the rest of the world. And they typically do not have very robust relationships with universities, except that some people, of course, flow from universities to work in the think tank for a while or undertake consultancy projects and so on. But there needs to be a much stronger set of relationships in the entire ecosystem of knowledge production, knowledge dissemination, knowledge consumption. And through that, the universities will be able, I think, to demonstrate their importance, their relevance to their own communities, their own countries, and to the continent in ways that you might get the interests of different ministries, including the Ministry of Finance.
Yes, if I may follow up that with three reflections. First, Roberta referred to Norway, and Norway, as many countries in the global north, as Paul indicated, are in a special position. Our current Minister of Higher Education and Science has, over the last year and a half, 2 years, at various occasions said relatively bluntly, Norway will run out of people before it will run out of money. And as a consequence, we got to make sure that the people we have the right competencies and skills, and are the universities providing and helping the people to get these competencies and skills. And there are a number of serious questions about that. And in that arena, and it's not just in Norway, but we see it in Finland and in other European countries, in South Korea also, there is the question of the balance between higher education, the traditional universities and colleges, and the vocational post-secondary education institutions, and the kind of inclination of our Minister of Higher Education to promote within the government investments in the vocational sector to some extent at the cost of higher education. And there's a debate going on around that, where important arguments have to be made by university leaders. So that's one. Second is a very interesting situation in the European Union, where there are fundamental differences between EU member states when it comes to investments in higher education as percentage of GDP and investments in R&D. And there the European Commission is using the COVID pandemic fund, the multi-billion euro fund, to stimulate, if not convince or even force, some of the countries that traditionally within the EU have had a very low level of public investments in higher education and science, countries in Central and Eastern Europe especially, to use a large part of the multi-billion investments that are going to be made from this COVID fund into higher education and R&D. In order to get the money from this COVID fund, the universities have to come with, the governments have to come with convincing plans. Now, that kind of intra-European solidarity, at least within the European Union, is now also an important dimension in the new relationship between the new agreement between the European Union and the African Union, where both the president of the African Union and the European Union have emphasized we got to move away from bilateral scientific relations and move to multilateral scientific relations. And that means that in the way in which within these larger intercontinental agreements, science, higher education, innovation, research are supported, is shifting from development aid to different kinds of perspectives and foundations. And it also means that the time perspective is changing from short-term project-oriented to long-term program-oriented. And a key component in the agreement is how can we reduce inequality? inequality in infrastructure, inequality in career opportunities. How to do that? And there the funding question comes back, because you need huge investments in the negotiation between the European Union, the African Union. The Marshall Plan has been mentioned. We need a Marshall Plan for addressing the inequalities, the science inequalities that still dominate global science relations. So what kind of investments are needed, and how can we convince, yes, the Minister of Finance, governments, but also the general public that these investments are long overdue and absolutely crucial to make sure that we are able, with all the talents that we need, to address the key questions around sustainability, renewable energy, inequality, etc. So I think we are both at a national context, like in Norway, with questions around competencies and skills, where Roberta's point about the way in which we communicate with the Minister of Finance, but also with the Minister of Higher Education, with the vocational sector, with the economic system, etc., is crucial. The European context, where a shift is identifiable to larger intra-European solidarity, which now is also being used in the relationship, the science relationship, through the innovation agenda between the African Union and the European Union. There are many barriers, there are many complications, there are many issues at stake, but I think the tendency is going in that direction, and the tendency of identifying and interpreting the importance of science to address global challenges. And this is something that also from the sector, from the higher education sector, needs to be supported if the shift from bilateral the global north dominated agendas to a multilateral equal partnership agenda is to be realized.
Peter, if we just linger on that thought for a moment and also go back maybe to my initial remarks on the future of higher education institutions, and basically what has come out of many global discussions and consultations when it comes to the difficulties within higher education institutions, being part of the problem at times and less so sometimes, at times less so part of the solutions. The big buzzword is transformation, transformative education. And you challenged me yesterday in a discussion beforehand. There's the question, what is the relevance of humanities, does not pose itself as much as that in the future universities will be interdisciplinary, and thus we must cater to exactly these new kind of models of universities. I said again, silos, tear them down, lifelong learning approaches, hierarchically, weakly connected institutions. You mentioned that yourself with scientific collaboration, we need to reform very much the ways in which we carry out research, especially from a geopolitical point of view, etc., holistic student learning experiences. So transformative education, I'm here looking at Roberta. Yes, I think we need to have a discussion about these things. We need to define what the future university must look like. And B, how do we convince the donors, the money agencies, the public sector, in order to buy into such a project? We know that universities have a 1,000-year-long tradition, have been working on a relatively stable model for quite some time. Are we in for some revolutionary models? And if so, will there be buy-in?
Yes, and yes. I think the first letter in our acronym for the STEER report is about strategically diversified systems. And I think the thinking needs to be moving away from university as the only valid provider of post-secondary education that is useful to students and society. Because, and to get back to what is a well-funded system as well, expanded access is going to require a multitude of institutional types. And they cannot all be the most expensive type, which is a research-driven university with the campus and all that is wonderful about universities. We know in much of the world, many forms of post-secondary education provide a lot of important services to society and to community at much lower cost than universities. And so I think what is going to be transformative is a greater acceptance of these institution types, investments in more teacher-driven, skills-oriented, not necessarily vocational in that they are directly connected to a professional outcome, because that is, right, anyway, it's hard to understand entirely what one does to become the commercial director of an ad agency. You can do that through the humanities without any problem, right? There's a lot of professions that emerge from just a really good solid learning foundation, but that doesn't have to be research intensive or research driven. And I think for efficiency in a well-funded system, institutions that are fit for purpose, that are mission driven, and that can offer students the outcome that they're seeking, the educational experience and the direction that gets them where they wish to be going, is going to be much more important. We mentioned the students earlier. Students, for some reason, are often left out of this conversation about what do they want from their educational experience. A lot of them do want theoretical knowledge, theoretical experiences. That's what most of us probably had in our educations that led us into PhD studies and this wonderful world of asking big questions and trying to solve big problems. This is, it's a gift that we have because of our education. Some other people, lots of people, want to build a skill that takes them through the career track, that makes them a little bit more money, that gives them a little bit more stability, economic and social, that allows them to live the lives they want to live, not necessarily through the full university experience. And so that is going to be a big difference. We're talking more about micro-credentialing, right? We're talking about short courses that are directly tied to the workplace. I think that's all relevant. And I think Peter brought up a really important point about demographic shifts. Demographic shifts, we talked a little before about the explosion of population, the youth population in Africa, in South Asia as well, and how is higher education going to be able to provide the skills and experiences and knowledge to support that expanded community with the challenges of financing that are in place. New institutional models might be able to do that. But we also see in, as we say, in ECA and in East Asia, an aging population with a lot of people who may not have access to higher education in the traditional time frame, needing to be reskilled in a quick way to be able to contribute to the economic stability of their countries. And that's what lifelong learning can do. But again, it doesn't need to be a full university experience. It can be sort of an enrichment experience that allows them to prepare for the world of work today. Maybe that was the one they left either to have children years ago or because they're just moving from profession to profession. So agility in the sector is going to be really important. It does allow for financing in a way that can be more adaptive to the outcome goals of that particular delivery device, which can differ based on the institution itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Andreas, we can
go ahead,
hear
Paul.
you.
Go ahead.
Andreas, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm speaking. Do you know what? Actually, I was wondering, did you, in fact, maybe for the last 10 minutes or so, go completely against online etiquette and actually keep your microphones on so that you can rudely interrupt each other at any given point. Paul, just wanted to follow up, yes, exactly, on Roberta's point. Where do you see the future of the higher education model or the university model and its financial implications?
Yeah, I agree with Roberta that you have to have diversification within the sort of the tertiary system as a whole, where you have different types of institutions that do different things, although they are connected. And you have to make sure that there is articulation between them, but they're separate. And they're different because of different market niches, different skill sets that they want to address and so on. So differentiation is critical, diversification is critical, and articulation. And this is probably one of the big challenges in many African countries, creating a regulatory environment that accepts this diversification and differentiation. Not every university should be offering PhDs. Some may be research intensive, some may be teaching intensive, some may be occupational, occupational sort of oriented, and so on and so forth. You are already finding in some countries that I know in Kenya, for example, you're getting students who are selected to go to university, some of them preferring to go to the TVETs, the technical education, because the translation from education to a job is much more immediate. And therefore, the ability to earn employability, in other words, is better articulated. So, the differentiation and diversification of models is extremely critical. The challenge is always the regulatory environment. How far is it accepting, that development? And I wanted to agree again with Peter's point that relationships between universities, say in African Europe, in Africa and the United States and so on, have to move away from bilateral arrangements, increasingly into multilateral arrangements. When I was Vice Chancellor in Nairobi, one of the things which used to be frankly tiring is getting calls from all these universities trying to be partners with us. First of all, we didn't have the bandwidth to have hundreds of partnerships. It was a waste of our time, frankly. It's better to have the AU or the AAU on the continent, the Association of African Universities, and the various regional associations in East Africa, the consortium of universities for the East African region. Of course, there is one in Sarua in Southern Africa, and so on and so forth, for them to be brokers of these relationships. And therefore, you encourage two things. One, you encourage inter-institutional collaboration on the African side, because there is need for more of that. And you also encourage inter-institutional collaboration between the Africans and whatever region of the world they are relating. And in that you can leverage and upscale those relationships to become truly productive and robust, and not fly-by-night relationships that they last for basically you sign the MOU, it gathers dust on the wall because really, nothing happens. So I think consortial arrangements are absolutely fundamental as we move in the 21st century. And the other point, if I can just conclude with that, is that relationships between African institutions and institutions in the global north historically have been very paternalistic, very unequal. Who drives the agenda typically happens to be the institution in the global north. And again, that has to change because Africans are very good at smiling at you, looking like they're agreeing with you. The moment you leave, they're actually cursing you and saying, forget that. Now, if we want productive relationships, it has to be based on the principles of co-creation. Co-creation of the problems, co-creation of the sharing of assets. Institutions have different assets. We tend to have a deficit mindset when it comes to Africa. They have assets. What are those assets that complement the assets that you may bring? And typically we think of assets in terms of money. And therefore, a Norwegian university will be richer than a Kenyan university. But a Kenyan university may have assets that a Norwegian university doesn't have. So how do we critically assess the assets of each set of institutions in a region? One of the things, as we know, as we move into the 21st century, is the demographic squeeze that the global north is going through already. And of course, it will accelerate. And on the African continent is the opposite, the demographic bulge. And there has to be a global compact between Africa and the global north and other regions, including Asia, of course, parts of the global north are in Asia, in which we address the development of human capital through higher education, through tertiary education, that involves African institutions and institutions in the global north that is mutually beneficial. Because as we know and was stated earlier, the African population by 2050 is estimated is going to be about 2.2 billion. By 2100, 4.4 billion, whatever, based on current trends. The point is that the majority of the world's working population in terms of young people will be in Africa. And if that population is not well educated, it's not going to be just a problem for Africa. It's going to be a global problem, economically, politically, geopolitics, security, and everything. So universities have to be in the forefront in Europe, in North America, in Asia, and in Africa to develop partnerships that are mutually beneficial based on the respective assets of each particular set of institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Paul, just because this goes straight also to my question to Peter, and that's well, I just want to quickly just make that transition really. Paul, you were speaking about assets, and Peter, I know that you're interested in the tension between cooperation and collaboration. Sorry, competition and collaboration. What can be done at the global scale if we level up and look at the more theoretical principles of it all? What are new forms of collaborations? What are new forms of synergies? When do we give up the institutional rationale that we need to be in competition with the next door neighbors universities, but also that one in the global south, or the other way around?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, competition and collaboration or cooperation have always been part of academia from the early days. So in itself, it's nothing new, but we see, as Paul also was describing, we see the emergence of new forms of collaboration, because the traditional way of cooperation with memoranda of understanding, that didn't work. That didn't require commitment, didn't require innovation, didn't require a clear understanding of what it is that we jointly are working towards to. And these new forms of strategic collaboration, from an institutional perspective, have these requirements, these conditions of trust, of commitment, of a joint agenda, of an interest in innovating education, research, services, etc. And I think that in relation to what Paul said, also provide some contours of the university of the future, because I think that the notion of networking, of alliances, of collaboration will be much more important than it traditionally has been in higher education. So you indicated, Andreas, that the university's model is more or less the same for 1,000 years. That's of course not completely true. The university was fading away at the end of the 18th century and had to be reinvented, and that happened mainly in Germany, and that model has spread then again around the world. And what we see now is that with the growing understanding of the complexity of the challenges that we face and the need to use knowledge, skills, competencies, but the adequate skills and competencies to be able to address them, that requires universities to collaborate. And that kind of collaboration has to be the kind of collaboration that Paul described, the kind of equal partnerships. But that requires a different kind of understanding of the notion of a university, the institution of a university, because it is a node in a network. In Europe, we have the European University Initiative, which is moving towards new types of cross-boundary institutions. And that idea, I think, is underlying strategic partnerships in the world, strategic alliances based on multilateralism, on equal opportunities, and understanding how inequalities can be reduced. And for that, we need the government, we need the public authorities, because the potential of these global partnerships, both at the individual, at the team, at the institutional level, the potential can only be realized when the public authorities take their responsibility with respect to the public funding of the foundation of these partnerships, because they will not be able to flourish only on the basis of private funding. That will be impossible. And I think we see around the world, and it doesn't mean that private funding is unimportant, absolutely not. There needs to be a private partnership component there too. But the public responsibility is crucial. And that means that university leaders also in their communication have to understand what this networked university of the future, what that represents. For example, what does it mean to have corridors of learning where students from various types of institutions that are part of a network can get access to education offered within the network at any place, whether digitally or if necessary, physically. What does it mean to share infrastructure, to share laboratory infrastructure, to share the kind of infrastructure that's needed to make progress, both in education and research. Also there, I think one of the elements of the network will be the profiling. We're not universities that are all more or less representing the same profiles in their knowledge areas. They will not be able to develop effective networks. So you got to, as university leaders and university communities, make decisions on what is it that we want to contribute to the networks that we're part of, the strategic partnerships, and what does it mean for our internal funding mechanisms and the internal ways in which we make decisions on funding, and how we relate to our public authorities and public and private partners. I think these are crucial questions in the transformation of the university that have a direct link to funding, both public and private.
Peter, you've brought us right to the brink here. We're slowly running out of time. That's why I'd like to invite you three just to ponder again. And this is, again, just to wake you up towards the end of this very, very stimulating conversation and ask you in very few words, what is a well-funded higher education system? Roberta.
I would say it's one that is well-informed by as much data as possible on what's being provided and what's missing, and that it's strategic in understanding that the investments serve a broader purpose, and those purpose can be clearly defined and articulated. I think a well-funded system is a system. It's not an institution. It's a diversified space with multiple forms of delivery, multiple channels for student engagement, multiple channels for research and research impact. And the funding recognizes differentiation among missions and funds accordingly. I wrap only with this idea because Peter, is talking about this. What, if you may recall it, a long time ago, I wrote something about the omniversity for IAU. This idea actually that there's going to be a sort of a supra space for institutions to do more, right? The multiversity has been the sort of driving model of the institution, but I do think there's something else coming, and it's something that Peter was articulating as well, which is like the Amazon of university provision, which offers any form of something underneath stacked credentials, micro credentials, online, open, whatever it is, but also the research track as well. That's something to be aware of as the sectors become, public funding is fundamental. It's important. It needs to be adaptive and agile and open in a regulatory way to funding different forms of delivery with quality at the heart all the time.
Quality at the heart. Paul, what is at your heart?
Yes. I think the university has to be of the future as well as the present, has to be accessible to as many people within society as possible. It has to be affordable, and it has to be accountable to society. There are a lot of scenarios that are being developed, on the future of universities. UNESCO has done some of that work. The OECD and all sorts of arrangements. I remember, reading the various studies that the OECD, for example, has done, and it touches on what Peter was talking about. They have 4 scenarios for the sector, and then 6 scenarios for investors as part of that sector. And for the 4 scenarios include what Peter was talking about. Institutions are operating in networks, and institutions focused on serving local communities. institutions pursuing new public responsibilities and the development of what they call Higher Ed Inc. And then, of course, for the universities specifically, some of the scenarios, have to take into account population dynamics, nature funding, mission of different institutions, their respective international dimensions, the faculty, composition of faculty and institutional status, and of course, levels of technological take-up. So all these dynamics lead to what Roberta was talking about. We have to have diversified as well as differentiated, but as I said earlier, articulated as an ecosystem, understanding that different institutions are doing different things, all of them important.
Excellent. Peter, last words. What is a well-financed higher education system?
What is a well-financed? Well, the starting point should be that the system knows what it wants and how it wants to contribute to its environment, to its society, and to the global community. So that's a starting point. And a lot has been said by Paul and by Roberta about the diversified nature of the higher education system that is functioning well and that is funded well. Roberta said in our earlier conversation, it's got to be agile, it's got to be robust. And how do you realize that? So an higher education system that's, as I indicated, knows what it wants and then is able to realize it. In the growing complexity of society, in the global demands and global challenges that we face, how is the university of the future also able to contribute to what our societies need to be able to function well? The networked university, University Inc., as Paul said, that's going to be part of our reality. We will not, as higher education institutions, continue as singular organizations that are more or less decoupled from their environment and their partner institution. That has been changed as part of the transformation, and realizing that the universities are part of society. They're not outside society, they're part of society. How do they translate, operationalize that? How do they make choices, create profiles within their institution, but also within the networks of which they're part? How do they contribute to more equal partnerships? All that has to be linked to the funding system, because in the transformation of higher education, the research finding of Burton Clark from the end of the 1990s, that there's a demand overload on universities. I mean, whatever happens in our societies, the kind of natural reaction to challenges, crisis, needs for development, well, look at the university, because the university will provide an answer. Well, only if we're able to make the choices that are needed for us to continue to be able to answer at least some of the challenges. And that can only happen when we are funded well. And funded well doesn't necessarily mean we need more funding, but we need also the regulatory and legal requirements to be able to make the choices to move away from the strong disciplinary foundation to a more interdisciplinary organized organization. And also when it comes to diversity, no university can do everything for everyone. So the funding of the university should also allow us to make choices without being punished for it.
Roberta, Malee, Bassett, Paul Zaleza, Peter Maassen, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very, very much for this, I think, very, very stimulating debate. Of course, the funding of higher education is a vast field, and we've covered many pertinent talks, and exactly on the fringes also of the ethics and the social, the ethical, the epistemological, the epistemic culture that needs to change in order to make a case to the funders, really, in order to make the case for the relevance and value of higher education, also of the future. And Peter, you said it, we need to know ourselves, we need to know what we want in order to make that case, and the communication is ongoing. So thank you very, very much for exactly these kinds of debates, which will carry us towards a more comprehensive understanding of what the higher education sector will need in the future. It's been a great pleasure talking to all of you, and I hope you all the best, and many, many greetings also to our dear participants out in the world. Tune in for the next webinar on the future of higher education of the International Association of Universities. Thank you very much, and goodbye.